Hi, Greg Hughes from 90-Second Website Builder. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about something that's called transitions. Transitions are related to animations. We have a video about that. Animations are a little more complex, but they are related. And most objects that you can put onto the canvas that can have an animation, in fact, every object that can have an animation can also have a transition effect. And let's look at that. I have on the canvas right now two common objects, an image and some text. But animations or transitions can be added to many more other objects like layers, etc. Let me show you how they work and what they are and some cool tricks you can do with transitions. I'm going to double click on this image and bring up its properties. Under the Animations tab, there's two sections, and we're going to talk about this lower one called Transitions. The difference between a transition and an animation is subtle. A transition is a type of animation. It's called an implicit animation, and it's something that gets triggered by the user's action, hovering on something, scrolling down the page, clicking, whatever it is, and then you can take an object from one state to another state. So a transition is just kind of two-dimensional that way. An animation is something that can run continually and gets triggered other ways, and it's a little bit more complex, but transitions are fun because even though they're simpler, you can actually add multiple transitions to the same object and create multiple effects. We'll do a simple one here. Right now we're working with this image and we're going to add a simple transition. There's a lot of different triggers to choose from, and I'll stick with hover, but there are some others we could use. Also, we want to pick the property that we want to change in this transition. And so what I'm going to choose is a property that's called transform. It might be off the screen here, so let me move the camera a little bit. There we go. The property I'm going to choose is transform down here. So what I'm saying is when I hover over this object, this image, I want to transform this to something else. And you'll notice that when I chose the transform property, I was given several options. This is a common transition because this is pretty easy to do, fun to work with. I can change the scale of it. That should be pretty obvious. If I change this to a 2, it'll double the size of it, at least horizontally, because that's the X scale. If I do it also in the Y scale or vertically, I could change the scale of the object when I hover over it. Let's give it a try. I'll click OK, OK again, and then I'm going to F5 so we can preview this in a browser, and I'll bring it into the camera here. And you can see that when my mouse hovers over the image, it scales up. Both the X and the Y doubled in size. And that's basically all that a transition is. Now, let's go look at some other things we can do. I'm going to double click on it, go to the Animation tab, click down here on Transitions, and let's add some more to this specific transition. I'm going to edit it. We could also rotate it. For example, let's rotate it 22 degrees. We'll click OK, click OK. F5 allows us to preview in a browser. And when we hover over it, that's our trigger. We increase the scale, and we've changed the rotation of it. Very simple to do. Now, transitions can be simple or complex, and you can build on them. You can have, like I said, you can have multiple transitions added to the same object if you want to. And again, you don't have to just use images. I'll show you a simple transition with a text object. You may or may not know that to get to the object properties for a text object, it's not the same as an image or a layer or something else. Those you just double click on. When you double click on a text object, you are entering edit mode. But to look at the text object's properties, I can actually right click on it and go to object properties. And here I bring up that same similar dialog, go to the Animation tab, and here I've already added a transition before the video started for a hover trigger. Let's take a look at it. All I'm saying here is when we hover over this text, I want the word spacing. That's the property that I chose, and I had many to choose from. I want it to change to a value of 48 pixels. In other words, I want the words to space out 48. You'll notice that there is a huge library of properties to choose from. Not all of these will always apply to the particular object that I'm working with. So if I wanted to change the border for this object with the transition, there would need to be a border in the first place to change. So you need to make sure that you're working with a property that's actually part of the object you're working with. But there's a whole library and seemingly unlimited combination of things to do. But let's see what this simple transition does. So I'm saying, in other words, when we preview this, I want to be able to hover over it and space the letters. That's all I told it to do. In fact, let's stretch it out a little bit and allow for that. So I'm going to click F5. We bring up the browser and watch what happens on hover, space to 48 pixels, and there you go. Kind of a fun little effect. Now, there are some other things you can do as you get more complex with transitions, and I can't obviously go into every possible combination, but I can show you something really fun. So I've taken another object here. Let me move the camera up a little bit. This is called a page header. It's a type of layer. If you go into the toolbox, you'll see that it's under the layout tools. So I've got page header. A page header is basically just a layer that always hugs the top. It's a header. And so that's its job, is to stay at the top of the page. Just as if you were to use a page footer, that's a type of layer that hugs the bottom. So I'm going to do a special effect with this header. I want it to be at the top of my web page, and I'm going to use some very cool transitions that make it kind of fun. So let's double click on it and take a look at what's in here. I've already made them, but I'll explain to you. So we go to CSS3 animation. You'll have several transitions actually that are all stacked up here, and they will all apply to this one single object. Now, one of them I want to point out here is one called default. This is something you may or may not want to do. All this does is it adds the duration by default to every property that I use in this transition. So it's just kind of a quick shortcut. You don't have to do this, but it's kind of good practice because you do get to choose how long and how much delay there is in the effect itself. So this is a good default, so I'll apply it to everything. And when you're building a lot of transitions, it's kind of a good trick to use. So that's why you see that there. All is one of the many properties. Okay, so enough about that. Let's look at the actual transitions themselves. So what I'm doing here is I told the software, by the way, I just double clicked on that to edit it. I told the software, I want this page header to do something with its width property. I want to change its width. In fact, I'm going to shrink it down to 80%. But when? When will it shrink? Well, when we scroll, that's what this is. The trigger is when we scroll down the page, I want this to be at 80%. However, you'll notice I have an offset here. This offset actually says 0, and that's not scrolled down to the page. That's actually scrolled to the top of the page. So what I'm really saying is when we scroll, but we're at the 0 pixel, in other words, the top of the page, I want my header to be 80%. That'll make sense here in a minute, okay? Because I made another one here, that's the opposite of that. I also said when I scroll down the page, this time down 10 pixels, I want the width of my header to go back to 100%. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is when the page is scrolled, this is going to trigger two transitions. Two things are going to happen. When we scroll down, my header is going to be full width, 100%. And when we scroll back up, in other words, to 0, it's going to be set to 80%. Okay? Stay with me. I know it gets a little bit complicated here. Some other things I can do. I also said that when I scroll down, or actually when we're at the top position of the scroll, top of the page here, I want the left edge of this to be set to 10%. I also said if I scroll down 10 pixels, I want the left edge to switch to 0%. I know we're getting lost, so there's a lot of math here, but you'll see what happens. And then I made a final set of transitions that say when we're at the top, when we're scrolled to 0, I want the top edge to be 20 pixels away. I don't have to use percentages, I can use pixels. And I say here, when we scroll down 10 pixels, I want the object to be 0 pixels from the top. Now, what does all that mean? That was confusing, wasn't it? A lot of crazy things in there that doesn't make any sense unless you can visualize it. Watch what happens. I'm going to click F5, and we'll talk about what we see here. So right now, you can see that I have a header, and since we're scrolled up, that was that 0 position. I told it when we're scrolled to the top of the page, I want my header to be 20 pixels away. I want it to be 80% and 10% over from the left edge. All of that is happening. All three of those things are happening to this object because I'm scrolled at 0. If I scroll down the page 10 pixels, I told it to do something else. I told it to go 0 pixels from the top and switch to 100%, fill the page 100%. So let me see that again. If we go scroll back to the top of the page, there's my trigger. It's setting itself to 80% wide, 20 pixels from the top, 10% from the left edge, and then I scroll down and I get my 100%. So you can see that transitions can get very complex. There's a lot of things that you can do with them. Now, is there a practical use for this? Well, it's an aesthetic use anyway. I'll show you something kind of fun with this set of transitions. Let's go to a page that I'm building over here where I have a set of layout grids. And in my top layout grid is this header along with a menu and an icon that I've added some special effects to, by the way. I think I've got an animation added to this object, and we'll see what happens when we click F5. Watch the header. You can see that the header came in. It's at that 80%. It's got that 20 pixels from the top. There's my little funny animation on my logo. But if I scroll down the page, you can see that it also is filling 100%. Now, this particular website I'm working on has a lot of different animation and special effects. It's one of the templates you can find in the template library for 90-second website builder. But I wanted to demonstrate to you what are just some of the things you can do with transitions. They're fun to play with. And the best way to learn about transitions, and more so than hearing me talk about it, is for you to actually just try them, experiment with them. So if you don't know what something does, give it a shot. So if you double click on this and you go to animations, go to transitions. If you want to see what something does, just add a transition and see what happens when you use scroll or when you use hover, and see what happens. These are the most common ones, by the way, hover and scroll. If you don't know what a property does or how it's going to behave, just select it and see what you can do with it. Remember to pick a property that would actually apply to this object. But the idea is to play with these transitions and use them to make special effects on your website. And you can see that there's a lot of cool things you can do to make your websites look really a lot more fun and interactive and really professional in 90-second website builder.